Okay, well, my name's Nick Brett, and Art's been going for a little over 10 years, and I've been with Art a little under 10 years. And Ian, your microphone's still on and you're a bit echoey. That's better. Yeah, thank you. So, yes, so I've got a few slides that I gathered together here. I was looking on the Smart Ringer website and decided that the notes there are pretty good, and I didn't want to just replicate them. So this is really a few notes that I made about assessing and to a certain extent my own opinion about what assessment should be. So I've got 7 slides in total, and one of them's only sort of half a slide, and apologies for the writing being a bit small, but hopefully we'll rattle through this quite quickly. And the first slide is titled Things Teachers Believe That Aren't Really True, and that's about teaching really, and assessing, but teaching in particular. And following statements aren't really true. First one, there's no need to comment when the learner has got the hang of it. Well, that's not true, because people who are kinesthetic learners in particular don't know when they've got the hang of it, and that's just the time to speak. So I'm talking about things that teachers tend to get wrong when they do get things wrong. Number 2, learning to ring up is not important if the learner can't manage it. Well, that's not true, because to get a bell under control, you're momentarily ringing the bell up. And some teachers will avoid doing that because basically they can't be bothered themselves to keep ringing up and down the bell for hand transfer exercises, which brings us to point 3. Some teachers try to get away with doing hand transfers with the bell still up, in particular in towns where there's other teaching happening at the same time. And I encourage teachers to think out of the box here, really. I mean, a rope attached to a hook on the wall would work just as well as a live bell. They don't necessarily have to keep ringing the bell down to do a hand transfer exercise or a hand ring exercise. They could use any old rope attached to any old hook. The fourth one's interesting. People ask, especially whether or not they have to write in the teacher's logbook. Some people find those little boxes too small, especially if they've got more than one student. And for module 2 in particular, you know, one lesson covers the entire group, doesn't it? And the answer is no, it doesn't have to be in the teacher's logbook. It can be any form they choose, as long as it's legible and kind of makes sense to the assessor. And I'll show you an example of a handwritten but not teacher's logbook teacher's notes in a bit. And the next item, the 4 practice note pages in the logbook are sufficient. Most teachers that I've assessed have tried to get away with 2, maybe 3 non-assessed practice lessons and ask if that's sufficient. But the point here is that during the assessment, I, as an assessor, can't assess all aspects of the course. There just isn't time. But I still need to be convinced that they know all aspects of the course, and that's where the notes come in. So really, the 4 practice pages in the logbook aren't sufficient to make sure that they've covered all those aspects, and they tend to be the same people that have to go back and assess a second time. The next point, they think, some teachers think the notes are only relevant for the assessment, so they'll scrabble together some notes just for the assessment and then potentially think about throwing them away afterwards. I find the better teachers tend to keep those notes, potentially in a clip file or something, so that they can read them again in a year's time to remind themselves of what worked well. The next one is an interesting one. Asking the mentor for help during the assessment is cheating. Of course, during the practice sessions that they've had in previous weeks, the assessor would have been there, would have been helping, would have been guiding. Obviously, there's a limit to how much the mentor should guide. I mean, if they're just plain taking over the lesson, then that's wrong. But if the teacher asks the mentor for help, for instance, to stand behind to see how the hand transfers are happening on a live bell, then that's a good thing. They've asked for help. And in the end, good teaching is good teaching, and we don't really care how the good teaching got there, as long as it's good teaching. Next one, all good ringing teachers have a good ringing style. That one's definitely not true, but the importance of this one is to make sure that the bad ringing style, if there is one, is not transferred to the learner. So they have to be very aware if they have a strange ringing style themselves. For instance, I was mentoring someone down in Dunstable, and he had an accident at some point in his life and couldn't bend his thumb very well, and his left thumb pointed up the sally whilst he gripped the sally. He had no choice. However, he had half a dozen young ringers in his band, and I noticed they all rang with their thumb pointing up the sally because they'd copied him. So that's something to be aware of. People copy what you do unless you tell them to not copy what you do. Next one, people say that they can't write a lesson plan because they're not sure who would turn up. So what's the point, almost? Well, of course, that's not true. Any lesson plan will be useful at least eventually. And also you're practicing making lesson plans and proving to the assessor that you understand the course material. So as I say, the lesson plans have to cover the entire course because the assessor can't cover the entire course during the assessment. Next one, they think the assessment is to make sure your teaching is faultless. They get very nervous if they make the slightest mistake. Actually, no. Actually, it's to assess that they are safe and they are good enough to carry on practicing on their own. Of course, they're not going to be as good as an experienced teacher. They're brand new teachers after all. Next one, it's best or easiest if the course is covered with the same learner throughout. Some teachers get very worried that the person they were teaching gave up halfway through the course and they're stuffed. Of course, that's rubbish. And the more people they teach, the more variety of learning styles they'll come up against and the better teachers they'll be. So actually, quite the opposite's true. And I often have to tell teachers, no, as long as you've covered the entire course, it doesn't matter how many students you've had. The last one I've written here, but it's by no means an exhaustive list. The assessor is concerned about art's reputation during the assessment. Well, of course, art's reputation is very important, but that's nothing to do with the assessment. There's nothing in the teacher's notes or on the course that says, make sure that you're not upsetting art's reputation. We just want them to be good teachers. So here's an example of a teacher's logbook that's been written on a separate bit of paper. And some people would say, well, that looks a bit scruffy. As an assessor, I would say, thank you, you've actually made some notes, which not all teachers do. Some teachers genuinely struggle to write anything down at all. My heart had to go out for this particular teacher. If you read at the bottom, it says, Sahib was tired. Nothing went well tonight. Try again next week. So that's the notes for next week, to try again when he's less tired. So this slide has been pretty much lifted from the beginning of one of the guides for art assessors, just to let you know if you didn't know what an art assessor is expected to do. An art assessor, of course, decides whether a teacher or mentor has met the required standard to become accredited. They have to be well versed in the ethos and approach of art teaching. And importantly, they have to be accredited at the level they are assessing. Consistent in their approach, so no favoritism. They have to be relaxed in their manner, making sure that the teacher is aware that the assessment is not an exam. And they have to be able to say and be brave enough to say if further assessment or practice is required before accreditation can be given. For instance, I've had a teacher say, well, my church says that I have to pass the assessment before I'm allowed to teach, because otherwise I can't get the insurance, so you'll have to pass me. And sometimes these are people who've had very high-flying jobs and are used to people doing as they're told. You have to be quite brave at times. And of course, the assessor has to be a pretty good teacher and a pretty good mentor in their own right, so they can demonstrate the teaching elements to show what is required. Well, if I have to do that, of course, I am momentarily mentoring, aren't I? But that's not a problem. That just means I have to go back another time to do the assessment again and at least assess those elements that they got wrong. Some people would say that a teacher is good enough if you would be prepared to give your learner to them. But I think that's a little bit unfair. What you're saying is, are they as good as an experienced teacher? But by definition, they're a brand new teacher. And I would say, is the teacher good enough to continue practicing on their own? If the mentor wasn't there next week, would they be able to carry on safely and follow the course properly? So what happens during an assessment? Well, the mentor arranges the date and time and location that suits both the assessor, the teacher, and any potential learner or learners, depending on whether it's module 1 or module 2. I have had a case there where the teacher's learner was sick and they were in trouble, and they said they couldn't do the assessment and I had to find a learner for them, but that's fine. As long as they let you know, you can go prepared. The mentor makes sure the teacher is prepared, and this is important. Logbook notes completed adequately, assessed lesson plan prepared. Sometimes I've had mentors just putting teachers in for assessment without bothering to check properly, so that's frustrating. The mentor reads and approves the prepared lesson plan and then observes the teaching session. So that will perhaps take an hour, say, for a teaching session, if it's going well, shorter if it's not, and if you're planning to go back another day. The teacher reviews the lesson. So that's the teacher reviewing their own lesson, what went well, what went not so well, and prepares the next lesson whilst the assessor is there. The mentor reads the teacher's notes and asks, so this is their write-up notes, and asks questions to establish if the course has been covered adequately. Normally at this point, I'd ask them to do 1 or 2 exercises that they haven't covered from the book, just to prove, or to my own satisfaction, that they haven't just picked on 1 or 2 things they know, and they can do the whole course. And then if further practice is required, then the teacher is asked to focus on those aspects for the further assessment. So this is important too. When I go back, I won't reassess things they got right. I'll only assess things that they got wrong. And if the teacher has met the required standard, then it's the assessor that recommends the teacher for accreditation, not the mentor. So this is an interesting slide, and this is the main bit, I guess, in a way. How can the mentor help the assessor? This is during the assessment. How can the mentor help the assessment go more freely? The mentor can check that the online theory test and declaration have been completed. It's very frustrating if you want to pass the teacher and can't because they haven't done the online test. Does the teacher have all the information they need to perform well? Third item, and this one most mentors get wrong, I would say, on average, being present during the entire assessment. Sometimes they don't even bother to turn up at all. Sometimes, of course, there isn't a mentor, which is a real problem in itself. And quite often they'll say, right, I'll leave you to it, and they walk out of the room. How can they possibly know how to help the teacher further if they weren't even there to witness what was going wrong? Has the teacher completed sufficient notes to demonstrate good understanding of the course? Well, this is, have they filled out the teacher's plans and the notes for the lessons they've taken? Again, it has to cover the whole course. Otherwise, the assessor finishes up having to go back 2 or 3 times to cover the whole course. Does the teacher have a good lesson plan for the assessment? And the mentor can put the teacher at their ease by stressing that it's not an exam. And also, the mentor can make sure that teachers and learners know that they are not being assessed, because most of the learners in that situation believe that in some way they're being assessed too, and it's their fault if the teacher fails. The mentor will introduce the teacher, and they'll encourage then the teacher to introduce their own learners. Is the teacher aware of their own ringing faults and that those faults are not being assessed? So just emphasize to the teacher that even if they're not perfect ringers, that doesn't stop them from being perfect teachers. It just means it's something for them to look out for, make sure they're not handing on. And the most important one, I guess, is the teacher aware of the safety issues when ringing, especially a bell down for hand transfer exercises. There's a list of items, aren't there, for a level 1 in particular, but the same safety issues are asked for module 2. Don't have your toes poking over the front of a box, for instance. Don't walk amongst the ropes, always tie the ropes up, all that good stuff. Some teachers haven't really given that much thought. So what does the assessor hope to see from the teacher? Well, they hope that there'll be a good, relaxed relationship between the learner and the teacher. In an ideal world, they'll become friends. And also the teacher will become friends with the mentor. You just want to see them working well as a team. They want to see good notes from previous sessions, showing that the course content has been covered. They'll want to see a complete, concise lesson plan for the assessment, but it doesn't have to be an essay. It can be 3 or 4 bullet points that just cover what they intend to teach for that particular session. They have to show that they have ability to review the lesson, to decide what went well, what went not so well, and how they can plan the next session to try and address any problems that we've met, how best to bring the student on for in the next lesson. The assessor will also want to see evidence that the teacher has taught different learning styles, ages, and abilities. I'm thinking in particular here of a lady that I assessed for module 2, where she was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and it was tempting just to pass her. However, I hesitated because the entire band was very old. It was all retired people. What I actually did was got her to swap places with another teacher who had all children. I swapped the 2 teachers around and got them to practice, and she got the hang in the end of how to deal with the children, but she was a bit like a fish out of water at first. So it was a good experience for her. And maybe that's something the mentor should have thought about. You know, is that person teaching all different learning styles? Because teaching children is very different to teaching adults, of course. Do they give good demonstrations and explanations when introducing something or correcting faults? A good awareness of safety whilst teaching, good observational skills and willingness to ask for help when unsure. So again, ask for help from wherever it's coming from. It doesn't matter if you ask your mentor during the assessment an opinion, that's fine. And prompt and meaningful and positive verbal feedback, especially when the learner is doing well. So that, again, that's for kinesthetic learners who have no idea when they've got it right. And many new teachers will just stop talking because they can't think of anything to correct. And that's just the time for some students when you should be doing the most talking. And a willingness to adapt for learning style or when a lesson is not going to plan. So this is my top tip at the bottom here. For the assessment, introduce an exercise the learner has not tried before. That brings out all elements, you know, talking to the student, teaching them the new skill. It causes a lot of conversation and it's great for an assessed lesson. That just really works really well. And then the final slide, and this is my thoughts about the assessment process, just as a group of sort of random notes, really. The assessment is simply to see whether the teacher has reached a standard where they are safe to continue practicing teaching on their own. It's not to see whether or not they are brilliant teachers. Of course, we hope eventually they will be brilliant teachers, but it's whether they're safe to continue practicing. Sometimes, sadly, teachers are put forward for assessment when they're not really ready. And you have to say, well, you know what, you got these several things wrong. You're not following the course properly. I'll come back in a month's time. It's a bit frustrating for everyone, including the assessor, but especially for the teacher. They've been told that they're good enough for the assessment, and then the assessor comes along and says, you know what, you weren't ready for the assessment. And the assessor has to face the fact that, sadly, some teachers never make the grade. Most do eventually, but some teachers really don't make the grade. Many new teachers need 2 or 3, even 3 assessments before finally passing. And I have to emphasize to teachers that that's not a bad thing. It just means that they're still learning. The mentor's task is to guide the teacher towards a successful assessment, but we hope that the mentor would still be around afterwards to be consulted. So a good mentor will still carry on mentoring when required after the assessment, but actually their job is to just make sure that the teacher's ready for that assessment. And sometimes the initial assessment becomes an ad hoc mentoring session, and in that case, I just have to go back for a second session to do the assessment properly. The assessor is a ringing friend, that's me, who's good at teaching and mentoring, and it's okay to ask the assessor's or mentor's opinions during the assessment, as long as they're not taking over the lesson, as long as it's a genuine question about a genuine opinion, then that's fine. It just means that you haven't missed something that's going badly. And the final note, we should be grateful that people want to become ringing teachers to allow our hobby to continue. In other words, total respect to anyone that says they would like to become a teacher. I think that's the end of my presentation.